Hi everyone. In this video we're going to look through a sample rhetorical analysis of one of the articles for this course. So if you haven't done sample rhetorical analysis of generation velcro, if you haven't written up a rhetorical analysis yourself, maybe don't watch this video until you write one yourself, then you can come back and look at this. So think of this maybe as an answer key. And so you want to compare what you've done to what we're going to talk about here. So I've written a sample rhetorical analysis based on generation velcro, which is an article in our textbook. I think it's really important to make a distinction early about the difference between analysis and summary. A summary explains what something is. It tells me the content, or it tells your audience the content of an article or the content of a poem. If you're giving a summary of a novel or a movie, you're describing the plot and the characters and the action. An analysis does something very specific and very different from that. It breaks the thing that you're studying down into its component parts to figure out how and why whatever it is you're analyzing works. So if you're talking about a movie, you're breaking down how and why the plot and the action and the setting and the camera angles and the music and even the credits and the fonts used in the titles, how all those things work together to present the message. If you're talking about a poem, you're looking at the way the language works and the layout of the poem on the page and the font and the voices in the poem and the characters and all those things. If you're looking at an article, you're focusing on the use of evidence, on the use of language, on whether or not experts are used, other kinds of rhetorical strategies and devices that are present throughout. We could even push on this a little bit and come up with a somewhat silly example, but one that I think is effective. And that's the difference between a summary and analysis of a toaster. We all know what a toaster is. If I ask you to give me a summary of a toaster, you might say something like, a toaster is a small electric kitchen utensil or kitchen appliance that is used to make bread into toast. It takes a piece of bread, you put it in, you push the lever down, and it makes toast, and toast is great. That's a summary of a toaster. That doesn't tell me how or why a toaster works. So if we wanted to do a summary, if we wanted to undertake an analysis of a toaster, we'd need some tools, right? We'd need a screwdriver and maybe a hammer to break some stuff and some pliers to pull things apart. And we start to look at the relationship between the plug and the heating element and the lever that pushes it down and the button you press that pushes it back up and the setting for bagel that somehow makes it the slot wider so that it doesn't pinch it too tightly if it's a bagel, and why those things are necessary in a toaster. So how it works and why it works, as opposed to what it does. So a summary answers what, analysis answers how and why. So if you're asked to produce an analysis of something, be very careful that what you're doing is not simply providing a summary. So this is a sample rhetorical analysis. So we're going to focus on the rhetorical strategies that work in generation velcro. This is, I think, a solid example. It's not a perfect one. It can certainly be organized more effectively. But let's have a look. So we've read generation velcro. Let's have a look through this sample analysis. So in generation velcro, Woodend argues that, and I've highlighted argues that because this is an identification of Woodend's thesis statement. So this identifies the author's thesis. Saying that X argues that clearly identifies the thesis statement at work in the article. Pervasive technology in young people's lives have resulted in large-scale loss of hands-on skills, etc. Moving along, the essay has strong elements of narrative, and the thesis is promoted by two particular rhetorical strategies: pathos, through the use of anecdotes and questions, and ethos, through the use of experts. As I mentioned in this comment, although this isn't a strong argument, this serves as a thesis statement for this rhetorical analysis. Now, the focus of the rhetorical analysis assignment isn't necessarily to construct a strongly argumentative thesis statement, so this is fine. A stronger thesis statement would make a more definite claim about the rhetorical strategies identified in this analysis. And we'll move on to that later in the semester, later in the course. But right now, we just want to make sure that what we're undertaking is careful rhetorical analysis. So if we move down, we can see how it starts to identify some of the rhetorical strategies that worked. Here we've got a sentence that identifies anecdotes, but is mostly summary. The essay begins with a personal anecdote whereby Woodend describes a scenario in which she's shopping with her young son, and a sales clerk observes to her that many young people do not know how to tie their shoes. Anyone who's read the article knows that that's what this article is about. This next sentence is a good example of analysis. It's taking the things mentioned in the summary and focusing on how or why they're used. So we've mentioned in that first sentence that anecdotes are used. And now we're going to explore why anecdotes are used. Personal anecdotes help authors build a personal connection with their readers. This personal connection allows readers to identify with the author and builds a pathos-based personal relationship throughout the text. So we're going to mention anecdotes several times because anecdotes feature really heavily in Dorothy Woodend's article. Woodend then references Jane Jacobs, who states that particular types of knowledge that was once taken for granted, are in danger of being lost. Mentioning Jacobs is an example of an ethos-based strategy. Right? We might not actually know who Jane Jacobs is, but Woodend introduces Jacobs in her article by saying something Jane Jacobs had written about in her last book, etc. This implies that Jacobs has written other books, and so we can start to think of her as an authority figure, meaning that this becomes an ethos-based strategy. If you're interested, Jacobs was a Canadian activist and author who studied urban spaces. And I've linked to her Wikipedia page there because she's fairly interesting. Another anecdote regarding vulnerable teens who cannot tie their own shoelaces further sets the stage for Woodend's thesis, again identifying thesis, which is posed as two bleak questions, the first, and then it goes on to explain the particular questions that focus on the thesis. Since the thesis is someone's main argument or main idea, it's often helpful to identify that and to start to unpack the importance of that thesis statement. Here we have a good example of an APA in-text citation. So I've just done P dot and then the page number. I only need the P and the page number here because we're talking specifically about this article. Your reader will understand who the author is and the title and the date. So you don't need to include any of that extra information. If we're using MLA in this case, we just simply put the number 182. Mentioning again the questions. So I've noted here in this quasi-thesis statement for this analysis some of the main terms: anecdotes, questions, pathos, ethos, and experts. So I've just highlighted the frequency of those terms. So it was mentioned questions several times. So these questions create a sobering effect and ask the reader to ponder the magnitude of Woodend's thesis. Here we move into analysis again. Asking questions to the reader is another way that authors build personal connections with their readers. Asking a question prompts the reader to provide an answer or to consider how their personal experience is related to the question. Like anecdotes, direct questions serve to manipulate readers' feelings and serve as an effective pathos-based rhetorical strategy. Remember that pathos is based in the emotional response of the audience. So if someone asks you a question, you feel like you need to respond to it. And responding to it makes you focus on yourself and think about different experiences you've had related to how you might answer that question. And so it is a fairly pathos-based strategy. The next section of the essay begins with another anecdote in which Woodend says her mother and her neighbors, all of whom live in rural communities, have freezers full of food. Again, we get some more summary. That's fine, you can include bits of summary. Make sure that when you're conducting an analysis, your focus is not on summarizing the text, it's on analyzing the things you mention. This anecdote contrasts with the one in which Woodend cites Mir Dawala, who wrote in the Vancouver Sun about wanting to grow vegetables, and then we have a quote here which is really important, but not having even the slightest notion of where to start. Again on page 182. Woodend says the same is true of herself, and even more so for her son. By aligning her opinions with the words of another expert, Dawala, Woodend helps to establish the credibility of her article. This is another clear example of ethos. Remember that ethos is based in the authority of the speaker. We don't necessarily know who Woodend is or who Dawala is, but it's mentioned that her article is in the Vancouver Sun, which is a notable publication, and so we're starting to build some kind of credibility based on the use of the experts that Woodend is bringing in to support her claims. Woodend then revisits her thesis by stating, well, this generation can text message, download, upload, etc., etc. Again employing ethos to persuade her audience, Woodend references another expert, Torkel Klingberg, professor of cognitive neuroscience at Sweden's Karolinska Institute. This is important again because mentioning that he's a professor and where this professor works is important to building the credibility for Woodend. If we don't know who this person is, or if Woodend hadn't mentioned him by name, or mentioned that he's a professor or where he works, we wouldn't necessarily take his evidence as being credible. But helping to support her own argument by including someone else's arguments, Woodend includes this reference to Torkel Klingberg. I mentioned that this particular quote was important. It's absolutely vital that you support your claims with evidence from the text. In most cases, especially in shorter assignments, this means quoting directly from the original source. If in this analysis it simply said that Woodend then revisits their thesis, but not given this quote from the text, then my readers wouldn't know what section I was referring to, and would simply have to believe that that was in fact what Woodend did next. But by including the quote, not only do we show the reader exact passage we're talking about, but we give evidence of that. So always support the claims that you're making, even in a simple rhetorical analysis, with references from the text, with quotes from the material, with evidence to back up your claim. So she's included these other experts, Torkel Klingberg, to support her claims. Contends that the offshoot of constant multitasking on electronic devices and access to a huge array of information is not the same thing as deeply knowing things. Again, page 22. Further, he states that our brain's capacities are reduced when we do not take the time to focus our attention. This section ends on a lighter note, it mentions, and we might have focused on that if we were talking about tone. As I said in this comment here, if we were talking about tone, we might focus more on this type of moment where the tone of the piece shifts. But it's only mentioned in passing because that's not our main focus. Our main focus is on the questions, on the experts, and on the anecdotes presented throughout. The next section contains questions, again, related to what happens if and when the people who possess hands-on skills related to survival are not around. We get some more experts mentioned, Jane Jacobs and James Kunstler. These are again experts. This is again an ethos-based approach. I then reference each of whom argues that far too many people today are not self-sufficient, etc. Again, this section ends with an anecdote in which Woodend describes her grandparents who, while unremarkable in some ways, were completely self-sufficient in other ways. I think that's the wrong page number. That's from the old textbook, page 207. The effects of this anecdote, so moving back again to a real careful analysis focusing on the effects. The effect of this anecdote is to help readers understand the time frame involved in the shift that Woodend is identifying. Most people either have grandparents or knew their grandparents during their lifetime. This again makes a personal connection between the reader and the material. Right? It's important because it explains the relevance of the point being made. So if we were simply say, the section ends with an anecdote in which Woodend describes her grandparents who, while unremarkable in some ways, were completely self-sufficient in other ways. Okay, fine, but what's the importance of that? Why is that included? Why are we highlighting that point? We've made an observation about that point, but now we need to unpack it a bit and explain why we focused on that thing. We need to explain that the effect of this anecdote is, etc. In the essay's final section, Woodend returns to the present via another anecdote, this time by questioning her own well-intentioned efforts to protect her son by keeping him safely inside. Since he was born, she wonders if this kind of thinking has made children such as her son utterly helpless. This question is especially troubling in light of the reference to Brandon Crisp, a teenager who ran away from home only to die in a rural setting because he lacked basic survival skills. Again, if we are talking about examples in this rhetorical analysis, we might focus on the effectiveness of this particular example. But we're not. We're focusing on questions, anecdotes, and ethos and experts. In the final anecdote, Woodend affirms her intention to teach her son basic skills and that her teaching and his learning are a shared responsibility. Now we've come to the final sentence. We're sort of summarizing the claims that we've been making throughout and mentioning some of the key terms again. The interweaving of pathos through the use of anecdotes and questions, and ethos through the mention of various experts, make the imperative to transmit hands-on skills to the younger generation especially compelling. As I said here, this sentence nicely summarizes the analysis and restates the main points, and it actually makes a more specific argument than the first paragraph. of this analysis. Saying that Woodend's argument about transmitting skills is especially compelling because of the use of anecdotes, questions, and experts is an argument that someone might reasonably disagree with. I might, for example, make a counter-argument that it's actually a compelling article because of the shifts in tone in the examples that Woodend uses throughout. Right? We saw cases even in this analysis where we might have taken up that argument. Or someone else might focus on the use of language or the organization of the article, or if there are statistics used in it, or any of the other rhetorical strategies. Might say in fact that ethos and pathos aren't the most important rhetorical strategies. In fact, that there are logos-based strategies that work in here. So someone else could disagree with this argument. Now it's important, as well as making a distinction between summary and analysis, that when you're conducting your analysis, you aren't focusing on whether or not you agree or disagree with the content of the article. Now, personally, I think Woodend is wrong. I don't think the argument that she's making in this article, Generation Velcro, is convincing. I think that there are a lot of ways we could pick her argument apart. So we could formulate an analysis that said things were not effective and unpack it that way. But whether or not you agree with the content of an article or the content of a film or the content of whatever it is you happen to be studying should have no real effect on your ability to analyze it. You should be able to analyze something effectively whether you disagree with it or not. If we go back to our toast example, we should be able to analyze a toaster to figure out how a toaster works, whether or not you actually like to eat toast. The same is true when you're analyzing a work of art or a text. Whether or not you think it's a good thing or whether or not you agree with the content is irrelevant to your analysis of its strategies. You can totally disagree with Woodend and think that she's completely wrong, but we can still pull her article apart and look at the way she's used ethos, pathos, logos, anecdotes, questions, experts, statistics, organization, all those same things, all those tools that we use to pick apart an article. Now, of course, if you disagree with something, you're probably going to be influenced to pick it apart in a negative fashion to show the way that things break down instead of highlighting the way that things are effective. And that's fine. We can't ever be entirely divorced from our opinions when analyzing something. But make sure that you're not spending your time during your analysis focusing on the content, whether or not you agree or disagree with the content.